Hello and welcome to the second SMAANZ webinar for 2017. My name is Dr. Ashley Thompson. I'm a member of the SMAANZ board and will be hosting the webinar today. I'll soon hand over to our presenters who will lead you through the content. Firstly though, I just wanted to say a few words about SMAANZ and our webinar series. SMAANZ, or the Sport Management Association of Australia and New Zealand, is an academic association. We aim to encourage scholarly research in sport management and to provide platforms through which this information and knowledge can be shared. We engage with our membership through our conference, held annually in November, in popular parts of Australia and New Zealand, and through the academic journal, the Sport Management Review. The conference this year will be hosted by Griffith University on the sunny Gold Coast. And next year, the conference will be hosted by the University of South Australia in the picturesque Adelaide. We invite you to join us at a conference soon and would look forward to seeing you there. We also encourage you to connect with us via Twitter using the @SportScholars handle or the SMAANZ hashtag, or via LinkedIn. A link to membership information is also available on the slide. Now, through our SMAANZ webinars, we aim to engage with the SMAANZ community, particularly virtually outside of our annual conference, and to promote and encourage interactive scholarly inquiry related to relevant sport management issues, and to provide support for participants to develop new knowledge and capabilities. Today's webinar considers the important area of sport for development, and we are very fortunate that it will be presented by two experts, Dr. Nico Schulenkorf from UTS in Australia and Dr. John Welty Peachy from the University of Illinois in the US. Now, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please post these as you think of them. We'll endeavour to have an opportunity for any questions midway through and at the end of the presentation. To ask a question, simply click on the question text box, type your question, and press send. To create greater personal engagement among participants, I will use your name when posing questions to the presenters. However, if you would prefer to remain anonymous, please just type anon at the start of your question. At this point, I will hand over to Nico and John, who will lead you through the presentation, and I'll join you again to assist with any questions throughout the presentation. I'd like to thank Nico and John for kindly presenting our SMAANZ webinar today, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to their presentation. I'll hand over to Nico and John now.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Ashley, for the nice introduction. I think we've got the unmuting working now, so thank you very much. And welcome, everyone, to this webinar that John and I will be facilitating here. I just want to briefly give you an idea of who we are, and I'll start with myself. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Technology in Sydney. I've got about 15 years experience in sport for development practice and more recently a lot of research. And my research work has been focused on international sport for development with projects in Sri Lanka, Israel and Palestine, and more recently across the Pacific Islands. So I hand over to John to briefly introduce himself.
Thank you, Nico, and I must say it's a pleasure to be able to present with somebody that I admire in the field, Nico Schulenkorf, and his work and engagement in this space for a good number of years. I'm an associate professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and like Nico, have been involved in sport for development in some capacity for probably about 20 years now as a practitioner, and then the last decade or so as a academic or as a pracademic, as I'll discuss later. A lot of my research has been focused on theory development, program assessment, as well as leadership in the SFD space, and we're glad to be here tonight.
Great. Okay. To provide a bit of background, I first want to say thank you very much for the invitation to come along and for choosing Sport for Development as one of 4 key themes or topics that formed the anniversary series of Sport Management Review. That in itself, I think, shows how far Sport for Development research has come in recent years. And I guess in this seminar, we want to look back and also look forward. So we are aiming to provide a brief background to clarify what Sport for Development means and how it is used in practice and research. Then I will go on to discuss some of the key findings of that particular anniversary piece that was published earlier in the year in Sport Management Review. And then both John and I will look at some of our own involvement and I guess program achievements, but also particularly at future opportunities in Sport for Development and what we think could be important themes and topics in the next couple of years. So what we try to do throughout, and I guess it's also something that we think is underpinned by our research, is to critically reflect on Sport for Development and trying to provide a link or a bridge between practice and theory, and John will come back to this at the very end of the presentation today. Sport for Development is a term that I think we have been using increasingly now in research for the last 15 years, but to clarify for those perhaps who are not particularly involved in that space, we want to make sure that Sport for Development is clearly distinguished from sport development. So Sport for Development has a clear focus on achieving non-sporting outcomes through the vehicle of sport. So it's going beyond the development of athletes from amateur to professional and actually looks at improving, if you want, society rather than sports people. So that's, from a definitional perspective, what we're going to talk about today. So Sport for Development, trying to make a positive difference through sport projects as a hook to then achieve wider social or socioeconomic health-related outcomes. The field of Sport for Development has, I guess, grown significantly through a number of reasons, and one is the increased political support that the sector has seen since the new millennium. A couple of key highlights there are the 2001 establishment of the United Nations Office for Sport for Development and Peace that Kofi Annan introduced back in those days. Unfortunately, that office has been closed earlier this year, surprisingly, but I guess back then, 15 years or so ago, it was a very big step to put Sport for Development on the bigger map. In 2003, we had the Maglingen Declaration come along out of a conference that was conducted in Switzerland through the Swiss Committee of Development, who was actually hosting the Sport and Dev platform online, which is often the key platform for practitioners in the Sport for Development space. And that declaration and its recommendations were quite important as the first big announcement from Sport for Development practice and research. And then other additional aspects such as the 2005 International Year of Sport and Physical Education, which again raised the profile of using sport for positive social outcomes, raised awareness of this field and provided a bit of promotion around sport for development rather than sport development. In terms of growth, also from a practical perspective, the platform sportanddev.org had about 150 organizations listed in the Sport for Development space in 2008. 3 years later, that number doubled to around 300. And when I looked last, that number has again doubled within the last 5 years. So there's a significant growth practically and also from a research perspective, which is something that we're going to turn to in a minute. Next slide, please.
To link into the growth in practice that Nico was referring to, even outside of the Sport and Dev website, there are probably hundreds of organizations around the world that are attempting to use sport in some way to achieve some positive outcome, very much at the local level. But along with that growth in practice has been an increased focus from academia as well. And we've seen that this has become more of an accepted and important area in our sport context, in our sport academy, and in the management research that we do. I think I can reflect back when I first started coming into academia that in going to presentations at conferences and looking at the lineup, that there were very few academic presentations related to sport for development. And now I think when we go to most of our conferences, SMAANZ, NASM, the European Sport Management Conference, it's encouraging to see so many scholars that are delving into this space. And this has been accompanied by more recognition and acceptance from our key journals. So if you're familiar with Sport Management Review, Journal of Sport Management, the European Sport Management Quarterly, all have begun publishing over the last couple of years works related to the sport for development space. So that's all very encouraging. We even have a journal now that Nico is one of the editors of called the Journal of Sport for Development and Peace, which is an online open access journal that practitioners can also access. So we've seen a marked improvement in terms of the acceptance and importance of sport for development in management, in sport management, which is very encouraging. However, it is a very challenging space to work in as well. Speaking from personal experience, and I'm sure Nico could comment on this as well, that you're working in contexts that are very difficult as a practitioner or as an academic. You're working with populations that are marginalized, that are disenfranchised, often that have been mistreated in some way. You're working in culturally sensitive areas with very challenging topics, and this can pose some real challenges for you working with people that have experienced trauma, talking with, interacting with them. In my experience, I've done quite a bit of work with individuals suffering from homelessness, and being in the field with them, on the street with them, talking with them, and just trying to understand their lives and conditions, and how sport is or is not helpful to them, but recognizing the trauma that they've experienced, that they go through on a daily basis, can be very overpowering. And so it's a challenging environment, to work in, whether you're leading programs, whether you're evaluating programs. As well, it's not without its critics. And so there's quite a bit of critical discourse about the power of sport for development that's emerged from an evangelical rhetoric or belief that sport has the power to really solve so many social ills without necessarily evidence to back up these claims. This was a problem for many, many years. I think we're getting better at that. To views of neocolonialism, where we come in with programs to supposedly develop individuals or communities in perhaps lower income countries without involving local stakeholders in what they really want and involving them in the development of the programs, to the skepticism of mainstream development organizations about sport as a fad and can it really be effective in development circles. So it does have its challenges as well. So this kind of all shapes the background about where sport for development has been. And now we'll move on to the next slide, and Nico is going to look at some SFD research and sort of frame that context for us.
Thanks, John. I think I can connect nicely to this. So in looking back at sport for development research that has been conducted, particularly over the last 15 years or so, there's a couple of key things I think that I would like to mention or reflect on here. Sport for development research comes on the back of a couple of key projects and theories, I guess, that we've been using to underpin our work or learn from a practical sense. The two that I've mentioned here or listed here on the slides are projects such as Belfast United, John Sugden's project that he started and that he wrote about in 1991, and that then moved on into Football for Peace, the flagship project that John has been running with the University of Brighton for the last 15 years or so. And I've listed it because it was a very important project for me. I was able to go and work with John Sugden and his team in Israel and Palestine, and you could see that someone who's been in the field for so long has had a very good understanding of how to manage projects, and it was a great learning opportunity for me personally, and I guess a great experience for those who've been involved in it. So some key projects started this idea of sport for development in the 1990s, but we're also looking at theories that are not new, but they're actually quite old, I guess, theories or concepts, such as Alport's contact hypothesis, which shows what kind of conditions are necessary for contact to be positive among groups, and particularly when we're looking at groups we want to bring together for reconciliation or peace-building purposes through the medium of sport, we're looking back at some of Alport's work and think, well, how do we manage best to achieve conditions that are fruitful for both rival communities or groups to actually work together? And I won't go into detail here, it's just that I think we're building on very strong theory and conceptual work that's been done in the past to then drive current research in this space. Now, the Journal of Sport for Development was established in 2013, a specifically dedicated journal to sport for development, as John mentioned, and the 7 key thematic areas that are covered by this are disability and inclusion, education, gender equality, healthy lifestyles, livelihoods and economic development, peace and reconciliation, and social cohesion. So under those 7 thematic areas, we've subdivided our sport for development research overall. Now, some of these are a lot more populated than others, and I think in the future work on disability, gender equity, and also livelihoods should probably be at the forefront of new and upcoming research, because we're struggling to find good evidence-based research there. But what all of these, I guess, research areas combine is the need for proper management research or management principles that underpin that work, and hence Sport Management Review as a management journal is quite important. And it's actually a leader in this space, in the research space. For the article that I was allowed to write earlier in the year, I looked back at the research that was conducted in all management journals, and almost half of all management-related articles are published in the Sport Management Review journal, which is a fascinating and quite an important finding, because it shows the dedication and commitment that SMR has to sport for development more widely. I want to provide a brief review, really only, of the key themes that I think stood out from the research that was published around management of sport for development in Sport Management Review. Now, you see the 4 themes listed there, and the first one on programming and design has a lot to do with the mechanisms and processes to achieve desired outcomes from sport for development projects. It also has to do with what sport we're actually choosing in particular contexts, what kind of additional activities can be included around sport to make a positive difference. And I think it's a great way of seeing that this is not a space that is a one-size-fits-all, that has that approach, but it's actually something that needs to be specifically designed and programmed with the community that we're looking at in mind. So that's the first bit. The second one, creating and leveraging impacts and outcomes. There's been different research over the years of how to really maximize the benefits and the reach of sport for development. So we may have youth or children playing on the field and they are going through the programs that we design, but how can we actually leverage this, grow it beyond the sporting field, and how can we achieve a ripple effect, as John Sugden calls it? How do we ripple out to the families, to the wider community, to policymakers who hopefully pick up on the projects and, I guess, drive development more widely for communities and society generally? Sustainable management and capacity building is the third one, which is often a critical point in sport for development. What happens when the funding runs out? what are we doing once the 1 year or 3 year funding mechanism ends? And this type of research looks at exactly that topic. What relationships with local and international partners do we need? What kind of change agents can we employ to make a difference, not only for the short term, but also for the long-term viability of projects? And there have been different models and ownership models that have been approached and that have been suggested. And I think we're still trying to work out what is possible in this space to make sure sport for development has a long-term impact. And then the final bit, an area that John is really the expert on, and he will return to shortly, the conceptual and theoretical advancements of sport for development. There's been, I guess, debate around should there be a standalone sport for development theory, or are we, I guess, borrowing from existing theories in different fields of study in the future? We've, I think, come a long way here, but we believe that more needs to be done, and that we should integrate and learn from other disciplines as well in going forward. And hence, John will probably get the chance to talk a little bit about a special issue that is coming up that tries to facilitate exactly that kind of research in the future. So with this, I think we'll have a quick stop here and allow for questions. Ashley, is that correct?
That's correct. And I've got one here from Sam Young. And the question posed is, wonderful point about neo-colonial views being imposed. Have you developed some useful strategies for avoiding such pitfalls that you can share briefly with the attendees?
Sure, that's a great question, and I think, I don't know if I have personally wonderful strategies, but strategies that I've tried, and I'm sure that Nico can speak to this as well. But one has to take time to really learn to know the local context, the culture, to learn to know the individuals involved, to meet with them, to involve them in program design, to welcome their input into crafting the program. Because without that, without taking that time, then I think we fall victim to that aspect of neocolonialism. But that's very difficult to do, to take that time, because we're often involved with time pressures and such, and it's a challenge to give a project the gestation period that it needs, right, to involve the local stakeholders. But without doing so, going back to one of Nico's themes that he was pointing out, which is sustainable management and capacity building, if we don't involve the local stakeholders and give them ownership in the program through design, through being part of that process, through being part of design of monitor and evaluation schemes, it's not going to be sustainable, because they're not going to be able to sustain that over time once we might leave or our funding runs out. So it's a lot about building those relationships. Nico, would you have anything to add?
Yep, okay. Thanks, John. I think I can only connect to this. The local partnerships, certainly in the work that I've been involved in international sport for development particularly, seems quite significant and important, because we simply don't know if we go to another country and implement a program, or wanting to implement a program, or having a funding source that wants us to implement a certain type of program, what exactly we should do. It's a big learning process for, I think, people in sport for development internationally, but also for the researchers. And when I reflect on this from the last research we were involved in with my colleagues Emma Sherry and Katie Rowe and others, in the Pacific Islands, things are quite different to what we know here in Australia and New Zealand. And I guess a learning process has taken place from us to try and engage with local researchers from Pacific Island countries and learn the approaches and research work they've been doing. One particular approach is called Talanoa, and it's about storytelling that in Fiji, Samoa as well, has been used to, I guess, gather information much more in a much more nuanced way than the standard interviews or semi-structured interviews would do. Now, all of that needs a lot of trust and engagement, and therefore also time. But I think to get the best results out of it, the local partnerships in practice and research are going to be the key to success for us.
Brilliant. And we have one more question again from Sam Young here. Will you look more at access for other ethnicities as sports people, coaches, managers, and directors in the Sport for Development Journal?
Yeah, I think I can talk to that. That's a very fair point and a very good point as well. When this journal was established, we tried to get people to come on board from all different areas in this of the world, I guess. The journal has since been shared, I think, in the editor space by 3 people that are basically from Australian background or European background, but in Australia. There is already a process in place now that this is going to be adjusted in the new year, and there'll be some change, and there'll also be some change, and we've started to implement that in the editorial board as well. We've always strived to find the balance between, I guess, finding key academics in that space that we can push that journal to where we think it should be standard-wise, but also to have a variety of groups in mind. That's a very valid, critical point, and it's taken. And as I said, we've been working in the background to changing this, and I guess I'm more than happy to talk about this directly if Sam wants to speak and get in touch with me. But also watch this space. Next year is going to look a little bit different.
Brilliant. So we've got a few other questions, but I think we'll save those for the end and encourage anybody else to keep posting the questions throughout. And we'll get back to John, who is going to look now at the future of sport for development research.
Great, thank you, Ashley. And now that we've shaped the backdrop and the background, we can look towards the future. And I think that's very important and very exciting to think about the potential for sport for development, and particularly here from a research standpoint. So Nico and I have put together about 8 different ideas that we think are some avenues to explore for future research. These certainly are not all of them by any stretch, but drawing from the review that Nico performed and from some of our work, we think that these are some areas that have some traction in the future. One being is the space of leadership in sport for development, and this is one that I'm very keen on and I'm doing some work in at the moment, and that is, are there leadership behaviors in sport for development that are needed that are different from how we do leadership, how we enact leadership and other types of sport-based organizations, mainly due to the followers, to the individuals being served, coming often from more marginalized and disenfranchised contexts. Does that mean that leadership towards achieving organizational objectives should be done differently? Within that, one of the aspects that I've been starting to become intrigued with is servant leadership, which, if you're familiar with that at all, is really not so much focusing on organizational objectives, but the leader focusing on the care and nurture and development of followers or participants in the program. And by doing so, then organizational objectives will be realized. And this might be some leadership behaviors that could be very attractive, very salient in this space. Some colleagues and I have a study going on at the moment where we're seeing that in our conversations with about 50 different sport for development organizations around the world, with key leaders in those organizations, looking at their leadership, we're seeing that there's a relationship between servant leadership behaviors and increased organizational effectiveness. And so this is one aspect that I think has some traction, not just servant leadership, but certainly looking at other contemporary leadership styles and behaviors that might work differently in a sport for development context. Related to that is this aspect of social entrepreneurship, or how one founds and really develops, in some senses, a business which has a social value or a social good. And when you think about it, this is what many sport for development organizations are. They're often founded by an individual who's passionate about a particular social justice issue, but also passionate about sport, and they develop a business model to be able to try to effect that change. And we think there's some opportunities for delving into and drawing from the social entrepreneurship literature in the management context and bringing that into the support for development space. How does social entrepreneurship emerge in this context? What are the challenges for doing so? Can social entrepreneurs sustain their programs over time? What ways are they doing so? So I think there's some aspects here that bear some empirical investigation going forward. As Nico was mentioning, in terms of the themes drawn out of the review of support for development research, there's still much work that needs to be done with regards to looking at program development and design, or the components, the mechanisms, processes that can potentially foster the outcomes that are desired by the organization. So it's really looking at that black box, as Fred Coulter would say. We don't know yet how all this happens. How do we design sport to best achieve these outcomes? How do we package it with other types of activities, whether they be cultural activities or educational activities or special events or other ancillary programming in order to achieve those gains? What's part of impact that sport has as opposed to, say, the educational components, the educational programs, or the cultural activities? So giving more concentrated thinking towards that connection between processes, mechanisms, components, the design, and the outcomes, I think is a way that we can contribute in this space in the future. And then lastly on this slide is the role of events and special events. Many SFD programs are ongoing initiatives. Occasionally you have one-off events, but often these one-off events are packaged in within a broader ongoing league or ongoing initiative that the organization has using Sport for Change. So how do these events, how do these special events interface with this ongoing programming? Are there ways that these events can be leveraged or strategically designed to best help achieve those long-term goals that the organization has? Can they help to sharpen a focus on the issue by putting the organization into a more mainstream light for a time being, which then can be leveraged in order to increase the potential capacity of the organization? So we think that there is a role of continuing to look at the role of events in sport for development and how these events in particular can be leveraged. And now if we move on to the next slide, I think we have a few more suggestions with which Nico will review at this point.
Yes, thanks, John. The first point is an interesting one because it brings me a little bit back to Sam's comment earlier, or the question, collaboration with Indigenous researchers. And I guess what we've learned over the years is that really the best type of knowledge we can create if we work with people that are well embedded into the sites that we're actually exploring. So it's a bit of a shame, and I guess sometimes perhaps also a bit of an excuse that we say, oh, it was all too hard. We don't really have too many Indigenous researchers on board when we went over to another country doing our research. It's also perhaps a bit too easy to say, well, sport for development is such a small field, and look, there is no one doing sport for development research specifically in that area or that region or that country that we're visiting. Surely sport for development is not necessarily a topic that's represented at every university around the world, but we've got so many connecting points that we can use with people from related areas of sociology, anthropology, even economics or health studies. And I think we can and you know, as Sam pointed out rightly, should do more to engage with a more diverse group of people, also as researchers, because to get better access to local knowledge, to have the trust that's needed to get the best outcomes and results, I think we can go a long way doing that. Related to this is also a chance to look at something that's been described as difficult in sport for development research, the longitudinal research. So I think we've got a great chance these days to look back at now perhaps 15 years of solid sport for development work and programs that have been running for at least 15 or so years. So this is a chance now to go back and look at some long-term evaluations, longer-term measurements, looking at people that have gone through the system, have been part of sport for development programs, and how it may have impacted their lives, or what kind of difference it really made in the long term. This is of course not easy. Finding the right people and staying in touch with often very limited budget is not something that is an easy thing to do. But I think we have that chance, and if we really want to see and claim that sport for development makes a big difference for people and communities in the long run, we have to go down that route. Now, the final 2 points here, capacity building and sustainability, I think we've sort of covered, and with the time on the back of my mind, I think I want to move over to the next slide, which addresses that final point here, theoretical development and advancements, where John is going to be able to speak a little bit more about an area he's been passionate about and that he's now focusing on again with some of his recent work.
Thank you, Nico. And this is our last main content that we'll be delivering, and then we can entertain some questions. One of the struggles has always been to think about theory in this space, and can we develop some theory about sport for development that might be universal, that might bridge different contexts, or is the space certainly so big and there's so many cultural nuances that this is just virtually impossible to do? So we have a challenge of developing theory, of bringing theory in and then developing theory, grounded theory based on the programming that we're doing. So we have a silo in many senses because academics and practitioners have a hard time getting together. And we do have opportunities where that's done. We have hosted a conference, a symposium here at the University of Illinois on partnerships in sport for development last spring that Nico was a speaker at, that was a bridge between the theory in the ivory tower of us academics and the practitioners who came from many different organizations around the world. And the conversations that ensued from that was very, very enlightening. So we need to find more opportunities for that dialogue to happen. The Journal of Sport for Development that Nico mentioned is a space where that can happen. The sportanddev.org website is an exchange where that can happen. So we need to develop more ways that academics and practitioners can talk together. Which leads to my phrase of the pracademic, which I don't claim to be mine. I adopted from a colleague, which simply means an academic who is also very engaged in the community, who is in the field. In sport for development, it's really impossible to do good research and to really write about it or theorize about it if we're not living it and if we're not in the field. So if we're going to theorize, if we're going to make this bridge as academics, we have to get out there. We have to talk with practitioners, we have to be on site, we have to be in the field, and that enables both theory to transfer from academia to practitioners as that trust and relationships are built, but also to theory to grow out of practice. And I think that moves to the last point of building theory from practice of can we and how might we develop more of a grounded theoretical approach and learning from practice in order to shape the context of theory. My colleague Alexis Liris and I, some of you who may know, worked on this with regards to what we call sport for development theory, which was grounded in really a program that he was running called the Doves Project in Cyprus, which bringing together Cypriots from the north and the south in this divided country, and using that as sort of a platform, an experiment for looking at what are the component parts, what are the aspects of a program that might potentially bring about some type of positive change. So looking at the sport type of aspects, how sports should be designed, looking at packaging that with educational initiatives and cultural initiatives, the type of organization that we need, top down, bottom up. So this all kind of emerged from practice, which helped to kind of build that theory from practice divide, but much, much more work needs to be done in this space. I know Nico's done some theorizing here. We did a special issue on theory development in another journal a couple years ago. And right now we're launching, and Nico and I are guest editing along with Ramon Spage, a special issue in the Journal of Sports Management on exactly this topic of bridging the theory-practice divide and looking at ways that we can do this better, how we can bring theory to practice, and also use practice to develop theory. So perhaps some of you on this call might be interested in submitting to that. A shameless plug here, and feel free to reach out to either one of us. But this bridging of this divide is, we think, very essential in order to sustain the field and in order to move it forward as well. So I believe we can move on to our concluding thoughts.
Okay, I will kick this off. Thanks, John. And I guess what I wanted to highlight briefly here in the concluding thoughts are some of the key points as a bit of a summary and looking forward. Sport for development research, I believe, has come a long way when we look at even the establishment of that field and its own name and I guess its acceptance into sport management research. We can say that the last 15 years we've seen continuous growth of sport for development research that's been published, and I think that's a good way to really make sure that we underpin our work with important principles of management.
Along with that, oh, sorry, Nico, go ahead.
No, I think, John, you're next. I'm just waiting for you.
Great. Well, I think where I was going to go is also to recognize that sport is important. And we wouldn't be doing this or engaged in this if we didn't think so and if we weren't seeing some traction in this regard. But we also have to be cognizant of the fact that it's really only, as Roger Livermore would say, one engine of development. It's not perhaps even the most important, but it's a way, it is a tool in the toolkit in many senses. It's not the only mechanism towards development, but complemented and supplemented with other mechanisms, with other ways of development. There's opportunity here for us involved in sport management to contribute to this development dialogue.
Okay, with that in mind, perhaps the final thoughts, I think we also need to be realistic. We love sport, and all the people that are probably signing in to this webinar are supporters of sport, and we know the great things sport can do for us individually and also socially for our communities, etc. But we also have to be realistic that sport is great for some, not for all. Certainly from projects that I've been involved in the Pacific Islands, when we're dealing with a lot of overweight and obese populations, sport is sometimes the last thing that people want to do. It's not something they're excited by. It's not something that they watch on TV, something that they do and exercise regularly. So there's other opportunities. There is also development in terms of music, the arts, events, theatre, other stuff that's out there in the for development space. We believe sport has some very great attributes to make positive change. But regardless of the projects that we look at, we think that the management of sport for development or any other type of for development is really important. And that's why we're pleased to see that the sport management journals and SMAANZ as one of the leaders, if not the leader of it, has embraced sport for development, practice and research over the last couple of years increasingly. So with that, I think both John and I want to thank everyone for listening in, and we're happy to answer any further questions that you may have.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nico and John. We have a number of sort of questions that have come through throughout the latter stages of that presentation. Now, the first one here is from Alex, and their question is, I would love to ask about how sport for development programs can be translated into the context of competitive sports to trace positive impacts that sport possesses. And they link here to the social capital aspect.
Great question. I can take a stab at that, and Nico can jump in.
Yeah.
I think it's certainly a challenge, but you do see, and then there's actually a stream of research in this. We're seeing some work done in terms of CSR, or corporate social responsibility for development. And that's often associated with more for-profit or professional sport leagues and aspects. And you see many leagues, at least in the United States that I'm familiar with, you see professional leagues that often have a community-based arm or doing projects through community engagement, CSR as we say, in inner cities, working with marginalized, disenfranchised kids, trying to provide access through sport. So that is happening, but what's not happening as much is evaluating those outcomes based on, say, social capital development of those individuals, of linking them, of bonding, bridging them with others and into communities. Those programs tend to be more evaluated on what they do for the professional sport organization instead of really what they're doing for the participants in those programs. So I think that's also, I'm not sure how you do that better, but it's certainly an opportunity that we have for engaging in some more research in that space.
Okay, and I come in briefly with a quick thought on this. I think this is really one of the key questions that you've raised here, that the whole sport for development sector and competitive sports have been, well, I don't know if they've actually tried to tackle this or if it's just something that they've seen as two separate spaces in the past. So we've got the sport for development side and then competitive sports, and for some reason I think for a long time we've seen this as two completely separate spaces, and perhaps it takes a different approach or a way of something that we described earlier, of design thinking, of looking at it differently, of how to actually bring these two together to make sure that some of those social capital benefits that are certainly the focus of sport for development programs are also translated into competitive sport. And also what we perhaps can learn from competitive sport and the competitiveness itself in designing sport for development programs as well, because there's obviously been discussions around minimizing competition in sport for development, or changing competition, or having different rules around sports when we get into sport for development activities. So I think that these two areas are not mutually exclusive. It's just that we haven't really found the right approach of bridging that gap. So I think that's an exciting area for the future to look into. I don't have a better or more clear answer at this stage.
Brilliant. And there's another question here from Katja, who just wants to say thank you for summing up the current state of knowledge in the space of sport for development, and notes that in low and middle income countries, there's often a situation where they face frequent staff turnover. And they just wonder how you can best guarantee effective and sustainable capacity training on the ground, and whether or not you have any suggestions related to that point.
Oh, Katja, you could have given me some warning for this question. It's a great question because we've seen this particularly in, I guess, the Pacific Island research, when there's a lot of upskilling happening through development programs. Sport is one area of that, but just in a wider sense, the development and I guess the capacity building aspect of people in sporting organizations. And you learn management skills, and there's an upskilling and the technicalities and the management side of things. And then once you've reached a certain level, then there's a lot of staff turnover, and the people that you've trained for years are moving on to other places. Now, I don't think that that's necessarily something that we can avoid, unless, of course, we can make sure that the programs that we're dealing with are actually, I guess, funded or are supported for the long term, or established with a long-term focus in mind, so that people aren't scared of staying with a particular organization, looking forward thinking that perhaps this organization is going to close down in a year or two because the funding runs out. So I think that's the first thing, to have, I guess, security and partnerships for a long-term viability of projects, which may entice people to stay longer and not jump ship. But I think from a capacity building perspective, the staff turnover is very difficult to avoid, given that in other spaces you may perhaps earn a little bit more money, which at least in the case of the Pacific Islands there, was one of the key arguments why people left sport and went to something where perhaps their passion wasn't as strong, but the financial side was covered a little bit better. John, maybe you want to jump in on this one too?
Sure, I'll jump in just briefly. That's a great question, and if we could figure that out, we'd really be in business. But I was going to the aspect of really knowledge transfer of many of these smaller organizations and such. The staff I've encountered, the staff's turnover is so huge. I mean, it can shoot a research project in the foot that you thought you had it going, and lo and behold, the people you were working with are no longer there. But in terms of developing that capacity of working at issues of knowledge transfer, so these organizations are often so strapped and folks are so busy, they can only really focus on delivery of the program. The knowledge transfer mechanisms, the record keeping, the organization of the files, of the programs, of how it was developed and why, and the method is often lacking. And so if we can work at that knowledge transfer as well and help them to keep that in-house, just like in business, when staff leave, then we continue to have that capacity to not have to reinvent the wheel, but to continue to roll out those programs using the same methodology that was used before.
Brilliant. And there's just another question here from Olivia. And the question posed is, can you comment on the role of action research when considering the idea of pracademic?
Sure, yes. Go for it. Yes, action research is, I think, part of all of this, and I've engaged in some of that myself, and I think it's sometimes challenging when you're in a academic environment to engage in more action research or to engage in participatory action research and field approaches that take more time because of the other demands that we have in our work, teaching and service and publishing and those things. So so sometimes that's a challenge to do, but I think when you're able to talk with your powers that be and explain about the way that research can be most effectively done in this space, that sometimes helps to gain support for doing more action research projects. So I think in terms of the connection between being a pracademic and engaging in action research, 100% there with that. It's just challenging to do.
Yeah, and with that, John, I agree it's challenging, and but I think the question is a good one, because what we've seen is in the cases where we have been able to be involved long term and from the very start of a research or a practical program in a way as researchers, the outcomes and the ability to learn and have reciprocal learning and sharing, and therefore a better opportunity to influence program design for better outcomes, is significantly enhanced. But of course, the research is often, if it has to be funded, not perhaps an afterthought, but the last thing that is on the mind of organizations in an underfunded sport for development or competitive sport for development space. And I think it's a tricky one, because researchers often come in to evaluate programs at the very end, have not really been through the stages of development, and just look back at some outcomes that are there or are not there, and they really come across as scary people in the real world. And I think with action research, if you are accompanying a program, if you've been involved with the program from the start, and you can drive it or support it, you can influence, learn and share, that way you'll be able to look back much better as well at the end of what has been achieved and where perhaps additional resources have to go. It's more of an encouraging approach. It's tricky to bridge that with your universities in the time that you have. We've talked about this, but it would certainly, for the long term, make a much better outcome for both the practitioners and the academics as well.
Yes, couldn't agree more. Well said, Nico.
Brilliant. I've got a question here from Sam. This is specifically directed at you, John. Will you look at shared leadership models as well as servant leadership?
Yes, that's a fantastic question, and yes, the answer would be yes. I think shared leadership models have some strong validity in the SFD space. Empowering leadership, emerging leadership. I think there's a number of areas in leadership theory that could be very, very salient here. I didn't mean to promote servant leadership as the only the only way to investigate leadership in the SFD space. Just sort of using that as an example. But I think shared leadership would certainly have some strong validity and could warrant some further investigation, as well as some other types of leadership approaches as well. The key really being, how does this look different in this context? Now, how might whatever the aspect of leadership is, whatever the leadership behaviors are, because of the nature of these types of organizations, is it different? And how so? And how is that then importantly connected to the effect, the outcomes that the organization has, which is individual or community development? So making that then not just on effectiveness, but really on outcomes of is this leadership at all connected to the outcomes that the organization is having or potentially having? So great question.
Brilliant. There's a question here from Sue. What common or great practices in evaluation and monitoring have you observed? And what common indicators have you observed across projects, if indeed there are any?
Perhaps I'll make a start. What common indicators and what great practices in terms of evaluation? I can perhaps start with one indicator that is the baseline and perhaps the least important and much overrated, and that's all how many people did actually participate in this program. And there's a fantastic, much overblown number that everyone portrays, and therefore it is absolutely, in my view, absolutely meaningless. But of course, it looks good and is desired by funding bodies, and that number goes and has to be very high. Now, evaluation practices, I think there's a bit of a difference between the projects that you perhaps look at. So if it's really just a monitoring and evaluation exercise with limited time perhaps, it almost feels like more like a consultancy job that's done and people are doing interviews or surveys, which I don't think allows for anything too exciting. But perhaps from an evaluation perspective, when you've got a project where you have a long-term involvement, and certainly from recent work in the Pacific Islands, we were lucky to have, say, 3 years, or with a PhD student, 4 years of involvement at different projects on sport for development. And there you can probably look at approaches to evaluation and research that are a little bit more advanced or a little bit more exciting. So I mentioned briefly earlier the Talanoa approach to finding out about new things as a way of exploratory research, and listening to people, joining, as a PhD student of mine just did, Jack Sugden in Fiji, spending a lot of time with Pacific Island communities, Fijian communities, basically living with them as a form of short-term ethnography, as he called it. So really living the life of Pacific Islanders in a period of time that is perhaps longer than any consultancy project would allow you to do. But with that, you can bring in additional evaluation methods, perhaps. There's the storytelling of Talanoa is one thing, but also with technology becoming more important, the video analyses, even iPads facilitated surveys that are a bit more easy on staff if they are facilitated by local development officers. There is stuff that can be done, but I think it depends very much on the time that you have for a project. And if it's just a quick evaluation and monitoring, I haven't seen anything too exciting or new come up, but perhaps we hear from you yourself or from others as a response to this webinar of new approaches or different approaches or more innovative approaches regarding evaluation. John, perhaps you can jump in.
Well, I could go talk about this for a long time, but I'm very aware of the time constraints as well. So certainly we'd be happy to engage in future conversations with anyone that's interested. And I agree with Nico 100% in that it all depends on the scope and need. And I think certainly in most M&E or monitoring evaluation scenarios, there's not a whole lot of excitement in necessarily the approaches there. But if we have that opportunity for more long-term research, more long-term engagement through ethnographies, through observations, through culturally sensitive data collection techniques that might be more indigenous to local cultures and contexts. I've used photo-elicitation techniques before, which can get at a deeper meaning through photos sometimes. So I think there's a lot of room for some approaches there, but I think we're probably out of time for really delving into that most thoroughly, unfortunately.
Right, and there's just one sort of final question, and I know that we're pushing time here, and it shows that there's a real appetite and interest for this topic, which is brilliant. There's a question here from Sally Shaw, and she says, thanks, Nico and John. What is being developed in sport for development? Even with attempts to put local leaders and researchers at the centre of sport for development, are these goals still driven by Western beliefs regarding leadership, health, and well-being? And is this perhaps to the detriment of local and or Indigenous belief or value systems?
Yeah, Sally, good point.
Great question.
Yeah, John, I go quickly. In terms of the leadership, so we've talked about leadership here before, but certainly I would argue that by and large we've got, certainly in the international sport for development space, we've got Western-based, if you want, organizations or government bodies that are determining the initial focus of the projects. They are also determining who is involved through a tendered process or whatever in the research side of it. And all this is then facilitated by Western external agencies in a developing country context. So I think the influence by these Westerners on the focus areas of sport for development is still very strong. The programs are not dictated, but certainly established initially with that Western focus in mind, and local leaders only come on board, if they come on board, as a second step. Now, the good programs that I've been involved in, and there are some, certainly also here in the Pacific Island with netball and rugby league, they've made sure that the local leaders will have a chance to actually take over time and actually influence the agenda and I guess make it more relevant for the local context. But that, in my view, is only really happening at the very well developed programs and not by the ones that are funded for a 1 or 3 year circle.
Yes, that's a great question. I don't have a whole lot to add. I think if we could answer the question of what is being developed and for whom, that we would be well served to do so. And I agree, where the idea of development is often from the Western perspective. And what are we developing for, and to what are we developing, and do people really want to be developed? Why are we doing it? And so I think I agree 100% with what Nico said, and the challenge being, can we develop more indigenous-based organizations over time that own what they want to do, that's not influenced by Western leadership, by Western ideologies, that is grown out of the local context and the local culture, and that any supports from more Western-based countries are very aware of empowering and stepping out of the way and letting them to design, work a program as they deem the needs to be, and not as we deem them to be. But you've really hit upon a fundamental challenge, Sally, and I think a good critique of what the development space is in general.
Right, so unfortunately we're sort of out of time now for any other questions. I know that a few people have responded in saying that they'd love to follow up with John and Nico further, and I'll be sure to pass your details on to sort of facilitate that post-webinar. But thank you all for joining us today for the second SMAANZ webinar for 2017. We hope you enjoy hearing from our two guest speakers, and certainly by the questions and things that have come through, it's been a fantastic opportunity to enter into discussions on this very important area of research. So we do hope that you consider attending a SMAANZ conference in the future, connecting with us via Twitter or LinkedIn, or for those of you that aren't yet, perhaps even becoming a SMAANZ member. Finally, following this webinar, you will receive an email seeking your feedback regarding today's webinar session. We're keen to continue to deliver these in the future and would appreciate any feedback that you're willing to provide. If you're interested in leading a webinar in the future, we'd also love to hear from you. But thanks again now to Dr. John Welty Peachy and Dr. Nico Schulenkorf for their presentation today. And finally, thank you to all of you for attending, and for those of you that asked some really fantastic questions and stimulated some more discussion on this great topic. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.